Hello, this is Alan Shipnuck back for another Fire Drill podcast. I'm in Los Angeles covering the U.S. Women's Amateur Championship at Bel Air Country Club. Matt Ginella is with us. He is in Ireland, about to play in the father-son at Waterville. But we've reconvened, we've reconnoitered because we have the world exclusive first excerpt on Billy Walters' much anticipated autobiography, Gambler. Matt, you've seen the material. What do you think?
I mean, I've been around the golf, business as long as you have, right? Almost kind of came in the same time. It's been no, big secret that Phil, is a betting man. He bets on, he bets on himself in the sense that that's the way he plays the game. There's a gajillion, rumors about his off-course gambling. We've heard of him betting on the Ravens to win the Super Bowl. We don't hear a lot about the losses. We certainly don't know the nitty-gritty. I remember at a Golf Digest photo shoot when we were at the Bridges in Rancho Santa Fe, and he rolled up in this black SUV, sat in the parking lot for what seemed to be, upwards of a half an hour. It felt more probably like 2 hours where we're just all sitting there waiting for him to get out of the car. He was making his bets for the day. He then proceeded to show us the bulletproof glass that he had in his car. And we were like, why would Phil Mickelson need bulletproof glass in his SUV? Like, what exactly is going on here? Like, it was just a really random, situation and odd, quite frankly. But when you read this book excerpt and you hear about the details of what he was doing and how he was doing it, and the numbers, not only the numbers of bets, but the numbers associated to the financial component of all this, when the number is a B and not an M.
Yeah, well, let's go to the numbers. Let's go to the numbers because people haven't seen this yet. Billy Walters was Phil Mickelson's gambling partner. People think he was his bookie, but in reality, they had this partnership. And Billy, as he tells it, wanted access to Phil's books, including some offshore ones that he said had $400,000 limits per game, per bet. And because Billy was too good and he would get cut off by his own bookmakers, or they'd give him really low limits like 20K. But Phil was such a pigeon. He's like, okay, let's go into business. So Billy was also a meticulous record keeper because offshore betting, interstate gambling, these are gray areas, especially 10 or more years ago. And so he kept track of everything. And he paid taxes, and he had a whole fleet of lawyers to kind of help him navigate the legality of this stuff. So these are some of the numbers from Billy Walters. This is the period between 2010 and 2014. He says Phil bet $110,000 to win $100,000, a total of 1,115 times. On 858 occasions, Phil bet $220,000 to win $200,000. When you do the math, that comes to $311 million just on those bets. According to Billy, in 2011, Mickelson made 3,154 bets, an average of 9 per day. And he says on June 22nd, 2011, Phil made 43 bets on Major League Baseball games, losing $144,000. And in that period that Billy's talking about, 2010 to 14, Mickelson made over 7,000 wagers on football, basketball, and baseball. And this is what you're alluding to, Matt. This is what Billy says. I'm reading from the book now. Based on our relationship and what I've learned from others, in all, Phil wagered a total of more than $1 billion during the past 3 decades. That's billion with a B. Now, Billy's not privy to the wins and losses, but he estimates that Phil has lost in the neighborhood of $100 million from all those bets. I mean, that's real money, because what, you know, in the book, Billy quotes Phil as saying that Mickelson's net worth is $250 million. It's probably grown since then. We know that with Live Golf and everything else. But if you're worth 250K or 250 million and you're losing 100 million, that is a massive percentage of, even if you're worth $500 million, you're losing 20% of that, just gone. These are pretty staggering numbers. And it's like you said, Matt. I mean, it was part of Phil's brand has always been, he's a gambler. Everyone kind of knew it and it was whispered about, but this is the first time we have the real receipts. Now, in my biography, I had access to a source who saw some IRS documents, and they put Phil's gambling losses at $40 million in that period, 2010 to 14. But that was just a snapshot. You know, Billy has more information, clearly, because he was the guy who was placing the bets and talking it over on a daily basis. And the volume is pretty incredible. When you hear those numbers, what is your reaction?
It's staggering. I mean, and it also, you know, it's a little bit like Tiger. When we heard and started seeing the numbers of women that Tiger had been with, or all the different sort of relationships he was managing, it was like, how could he manage all of that and still have that level of success on the golf course? To me, it's a very similar reaction, certainly a different situation, but the wherewithal, the game as we know it is so complex and complicated and hard to master. You have to be right in your mind, in your spirit, in your soul, in your convictions of what you're capable of in order to execute on a day-to-day, week-to-week, tour-to-tour. Like, good. I mean, so that was kind of like my thought, is like, oh my God, both of these guys have achieved this type of success while also juggling these, what would be perceived to be shitstorms off the course. It's, you know, in some ways it's actually really impressive. I mean, that's that many bets, tracking all that stuff. I mean, that's a lot.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's remarkable that, as you're saying, that the two greatest golfers of the last, 3 decades had these addiction issues. And, Phil has used the word addiction, talking about his gambling. Tiger's been to treatment at least twice that we know of for addictions. And it always was that belief that to play the highest level of golf, you had to have a clear mind. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they needed that constant rush and that energy and the juice. And then when they got between the ropes, that's when everything kind of quieted down. And that was their respite from all the chaos. And maybe that's why they could lock in during those 4 hours. I don't know. It does put to lie what, golfers have always said, when I'm going through a divorce, when I'm whatever, I couldn't think about golf. I couldn't play golf. My father died. It affected my golf for 2 years. Like, these guys just sailed through the chaos. It's remarkable.
Speaking of chaos, 2012 Ryder Cup, in this book excerpt, Billy says Phil calls him to try to put a bet on Team USA, Medina.
Yeah.
This was the Ryder Cup. Billy essentially says, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this now. And says, I don't know if he got the bet in or if he went somewhere else, but he came to me with the bet. And I was like, you're crossing lines here that I'm not comfortable being a part of. Pete Rose lines.
Yeah, I'm going to read that passage because it's really interesting. Phil calls him up from Medina, and this is Billy's words. He was so confident that he asked me to place a $400,000 wager for him on the U.S. team to win. I could not believe what I was hearing. Have you lost your fucking mind? I told him. Don't you remember what happened to Pete Rose? It's pretty funny. And again, that was always the defense of Pete Rose. Advocates was that, well, when you're betting on your own team, you're not really doing anything wrong because you're trying to win the game no matter what. But the counter argument is that when you have that money and that stress, you might do things in the short term that's not going to help the team over a long season. You're going to burn up your bullpen because you got $50,000 on this game. You don't care. You're bringing your closer in the third inning if you have to, right? Like it can affect your strategy. Now, with Phil, he's used to, $400,000 is a third place check on the tour back then, whatever. He's used to playing for money, but it just speaks to a desperation. Like the Ryder Cup has enough pressure. You need the extra juice of a bet. It's crazy. I mean, there's enough action between the ropes at the Ryder Cup. You need another 400K. Like it's insane. And as Billy says, we don't know if Phil placed the bet, but it speaks to his frame of mind. And we know Phil had other bookies and other avenues for placing bets because some of this stuff has come out in public. Like also going back to your bulletproof glass, like, Phil was mixed up with Dandy Don, this mobbed up dude in Detroit. And that became a whole public mess. There was this guy, Greg Silveri in San Diego, went to prison for, fraud related to this wire transfer that was sent to a high profile golfer, the initials PM. That's what it said in the court documents. Like, there was this guy, Brian Zurif, who Phil was one of his betting partners. And he was allegedly, he wound up getting in trouble with the feds. Allegedly, it was linked to the Russian mafia. Like there was some shady characters very close to Phil, ergo the bulletproof glass. And so, Billy didn't take the bet, but we don't know who the next guy Phil called and how big the number got. And if you remember the Miracle at Medina, this is the Ryder Cup we're talking about. The whole thing flipped in singles when Justin Rose came back and beat Phil on the last hole. Rose made that bomb on 17, and then he takes the match. That was the key moment in this historic comeback for Europe. Now, Phil was trying to win, yes. Of course he was. And if he was betting on himself, he was trying to win extra hard. But that's the whole point. Like there's already enough pressure. If Phil has some huge bet out there with some shady character for whom you need to have bulletproof glass, like that's just one more like log on the fire. It's insane that he would put himself in that position.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you go back to Saturday. I think you go back to Saturday afternoon, and if you recall, I believe it was Phil and Keegan Bradley who were basically unbeatable and closed out their Saturday morning match and alt shot. It's like both of them only hit a total of like 22 shots, some ridiculously low number. They were playing so well. And he's the one who went to Love and said, we're sitting out for Saturday afternoon. And Keegan Bradley was like, we're sitting out? What like, I thought it flipped that Saturday afternoon when Europe caught a little momentum to try to get some afternoon wins leading into the singles the next day.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. Like, what was Phil? Yeah, was Phil resting up for his singles match because he had a huge wager on it?
Remember, it took everybody by surprise. Like, why are they not playing? They're unbeatable. Keep them going.
Right. Yeah, they went 3-0 in the first three frames, Mickelson and Bradley, and they were housing dudes. I mean, they beat Luke Donald and Sergio Garcia, probably one of the strongest European teams ever, 4-3. Then they beat Rory and beat Rory and Graham McDowell in afternoon four-ball. Then you go to Saturday morning, and they take on Lee Westwood and Luke Donald, a couple of absolute warriors. They beat him 7-6, like you're saying, and that was a head scratcher. Why are they resting? Now, there's a million things going on here. Phil has psoriatic arthritis. He's old. We're just speculating. But it does introduce this possibility, like there was something going on, and it forces you to have some revisionist history when you know that Phil's out there on the eve of the Ryder Cup trying to place bets.
Alan, you kind of started this asking a little bit about my reaction. You have spent time with Billy. You went down and met with him as you were reporting out your Phil book. You've dealt with him and his lawyers throughout this whole process, and then you get the excerpt. You get the excerpt on behalf of Fire Pit Collective and giving us this exclusive. What was your reaction when you actually got to read this chapter?
Yeah, and actually read the whole book, and It was interesting because I did sit with Billy when I was reporting the Phil book. He's not, and I think now it can be told because it's all out in the public domain. You know, I flew to Vegas, and our whole conversation was off the record for 2 hours. We talked, and he wanted me to know who Phil was, and he wanted me to know a lot of things, but he didn't want it in my book because I think he knew he was going to write his own, and he didn't want to give away the goods. And he told me that Ryder Cup story, and for 2 years I've had to sit on it. I mean, I've never breathed it out loud. It's never been in print. And even as Phil was talking talking trash about me in various forums, saying that I was
saying
unfair,
that you don't know, like essentially you don't know the difference between on the record and off the record, like as it this is proof you know the difference between what is and what isn't on and off the record.
It was insane, like, because that would have, it's a monster revelation, and it's probably going to be the biggest headline out of all of this. Everyone already knew that Phil bet a lot of money. The receipts are interesting and they're eye popping, but I think the Ryder Cup bit is the biggest revelation in Billy's book, and obviously in our excerpt. And I've known it for years, and I couldn't say it, and so when Phil said I didn't treat him fairly, it was like such an eye roll because I had this. It would have sent my book to the moon even more, but I had an agreement with Billy. I always honor those agreements. Yeah, it was interesting. It was cathartic to see it in print. Honestly, all right, at least now it's out. This is what happened. This is just the truth. This is the reality. My reaction, and we should say, there's a second chapter that where Billy goes into the insider trading case, and we're sort of embargoed from talking about that from the publisher. Like, our agreement was we'd only talk about what's in the excerpt, and that's fair. But of course, I've read that chapter, and it's pretty withering. I will say that in our excerpt, Billy talks about that, and he kind of teases it a little bit, and as he writes, and as Billy writes in this chapter that we've excerpted, about Phil, I never told him I had inside information about stocks, and he knows it. All Phil had to do was publicly say it. He refused. The outcome cost me my freedom, tens of millions of dollars, and a heartbreak I still struggle with daily. While I was in prison, my daughter committed suicide. I still believe I could have saved her if I'd been on the outside. So, Billy goes into great detail about the insider trading and Phil's role. And Phil was never charged with a crime. He did have to return about $1 million in ill-gotten gains, which is a favorite term of mine. So it's interesting to read Billy's take on all that, and that'll come out in other places. We won't talk about it here, but I think that on the whole, Phil will survive this excerpt, this book, and these revelations. It was interesting when he started self-identifying as a gambling addict, which was only happened in the wake of the publication of my book. And, that takes courage. That takes bravery to come out in public for anybody. We all have people in our lives who struggle with some kind of addiction. And that's the hardest part, is for them to admit it. And for a public figure to say it publicly, that's a big deal. So I salute Phil's courage there. And, the cynic would say that he knew what was coming in Billy's book, and that was sort of rebranding. We all, I think societally, we have more empathy for people who struggle with addiction versus those who are just reckless or foolish, right? And so he'll say, "Hey, I was a gambling addict. I got in over my head on the bets. That was a long time ago." I think he'll survive that part. The Ryder Cup bit, I mean, again, Pete Rose was banned for life from baseball. He's not in the Hall of Fame as the all-time hits leader because of gambling on his own team, which is what Billy alleged Phil wanted to do. Now, I'm sure, knowing Phil and knowing how this is going to play out, Phil's going to say, "Oh, I was just joking. That was just locker room talk. I would never bet on the Ryder Cup. I never placed a bet. It never happened." And in the absence of some other person like Billy Walters coming forward and saying, "Yeah, I cashed that bet for Phil," he'll probably survive that too. The insider trading chapter, it's very unflattering towards Phil, as people can probably guess from that little bit that I just read. But again, Phil was never charged with a crime. And there's no new information in what Billy says that would probably change that. So I think he'll survive that chapter too. I mean, it's the through line in the Phil Mickelson story is he just kind of wiggles out of these things. And there have been so many blow-ups and controversies in his public life. And he's kind of skated on all of them. Even, the revelations that came out of my book, calling, the public investment fund guys scary motherfuckers, and all that uproar, getting suspended by the tour. In some ways, Phil's been vindicated. Like, the PGA Tour is now doing business, potentially, if they can consummate the framework agreement, with those very same scary motherfuckers. And a lot of the changes that Phil was calling for and advocating for have come to fruition. So even that was a monumental controversy in his life. He's kind of survived that. He's just the ultimate survivor. So I think that he's going to be okay, but it just adds more context, more nuance. And I think the biggest takeaway is that Billy Walters and Phil Mickelson were best friends, and Billy was Phil's mentor. And in the end, Phil completely torched that relationship and did a lot of weird things and was not there for his friend when his friend was in a dire circumstance. And I think that's probably the most damaging thing. It's not the money. We knew he bet a lot. He's going to skate on the Ryder Cup thing. The insider trading bit's already mostly public, but that, you have a friend who's drowning. He's in the whitewater, and you're potentially holding, a rope you can throw to him, and Phil never threw the rope. In Billy's telling, that's rough, man. I mean, that really hits you on a human level, and I think that's probably gonna, on some level, curdle feelings towards Phil more than anything else in this book.
The last line in the book excerpt that Billy writes is, "As my book makes clear, Phil is not always the person he seems to be." And I had someone recently in sort of casual conversation out on the golf course ask me, so why was Alan writing a book on Phil? The timing of what he said, you trying to get a hold of him not let it, sort of you convincing him that his inner circle needed to kind of talk to you so that the book that you were writing could be fair and balanced. And so someone was saying, why was Phil writing a book? Why was Alan writing a book on Phil? And I was like, have you read the book? It's because it's all of this, because he's so it's complicated, it's layered, it's complex. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, like the Phil being this big onion, and just the peeling back of who he is and what he is and how he operates and the relationships he has or the bets that he had. Like, it's just so much. It's, and, even to this day, like, and the Saudis and the breakaway league and he is quite a character.
Yeah. And, I have my own book coming out in a little while about the Live Golf PGA Tour. And I've learned so much about Phil in this process. And of course, everyone knows he was deep in league with the Saudis, but there was two other breakaway leagues that Phil was heavily involved with. He was advocating for the PGL, the Premier Golf League, which was a precursor to all this. And there's a hilarious bit where I'm ruining a funny part in my book, but he calls up Keith Pelley of the European Tour, CEO of the European Tour. He's like, "Keith, you're a visionary. The PGL is going to work. Like, you got to make it happen." And he's like, "If we just need one player to sign, and everyone will sign, including Tiger," and like Phil's just giving him this hard sell. Like, it's just funny that he calls up Pelley and "You're a visionary." Like, I just love it. It's so over the top. And then there was this third rail thing that Phil, he took to this big private equity firm in New York, and was kind of like, he had this other idea. This came out in the New York Post a while ago, and it's just like he was working four sides of the street. He was negotiating with the tour, with the Saudis, with the Premier Golf League, and with these private equity guys, and it's just unbelievable. I mean, again, you could say Phil was right. Like one of the lessons from this framework agreement and all of this is that the tour business model was outdated, and they needed to be for profit like the other leagues are in professional sports. And they needed to have the ability to take outside money. And Phil saw that very clearly, but he was just trying to make it happen in the back alleys, in the shadows. But he wasn't wrong on the merits. It was just the way he handled everything. And, again, I sent a tweet out about the Billy Walters stuff this morning, and some folks have responded. It's his money. He can do what he wants. Sure. That's totally true. It is his money. He can set it on fire. However, where it becomes more complex is if he's betting so much and losing so much that he has to chase money, and that leads to a complete reshifting of the entire professional golf landscape, which might or might not be exactly what happened, then Phil's private gambling becomes of keen interest to the entire golf world. And it has had this cascading effect on the entire sport. So, it's interesting. I fully, when players get in trouble with drugs, alcohol, women, like, I try not to wag my finger. I try not to moralize. Like, we're all flawed. We all make mistakes. But when there's larger consequences, then it spills into the public domain. And so it's just another fascinating chapter. I mean, I remember you and I, Matt, talking like 10 years ago about golf has to prepare for the post Tiger and Phil era, right? Like, they can't go on forever as the headliners. But here we are. Like, Phil's in his 50s, Tiger's broken down, heading for age 50, and they still dominate the discourse in every way. Tiger is now going to save the PGA Tour by joining the board, and he organized the meeting in Delaware and all of it. And the whole world vibrates whenever he tees it up, even when he misses the cut. And here's Phil, almost won the Masters this year, and he's the center of all these storms. And now there's this Billy Walters book, and he has a prominent role in my next book. It's like, we can't quit these guys. Like, they just won't go away. The cult of personality around Tiger and Phil is so monumental. We're never going to escape them. I mean, you and I are going to be in our 70s, and so are they, and we're still going to be talking about them and writing about them. It's unbelievable. But I mean, maybe we're lucky. They're certainly fascinating, and their flaws and their human element is part of what makes it so interesting. Like take Derek Jeter, or I don't know, Patrick Mahomes or Mike Trout. Those are better examples. Transcendent athletes, but totally boring. And you can't talk about them for 50 years. They're just great athletes. But Phil and Tiger exist on so many different levels, and they become these moral questions, and they become these mirrors where we have to look at ourselves and society as a whole. And it's an unbelievable time to be alive as a golf fan and being in the golf media.
Oh, yeah, and we have also been talking about that since the mid-90s, which is how lucky are we to be alive and in this industry covering Tiger and Phil, like in the bloodstream of what these guys are pumping through the sort of the bodies of sports fans, and brought golf. Golf needed Arnold Palmer, and Arnold Palmer needed Jack Nicklaus. Golf needed Tiger Woods, and Tiger Woods needed Phil Mickelson, because you have to have someone to go along with you. And we caught the tail end of the first part, of Tiger and Jack. I mean, of Arnold and Jack. We got Tiger and then Phil. I think the bigger question for me is who is the next sort of, competitor and, golfer for that matter, who's going to fill this insane void on the course of what these guys, Brooks Koepka and Bryson DeChambeau, or, that's tiddlywinks compared to like what we're talking about with Tiger and Phil.
I know. Well, probably no one, because they've been such cautionary tales. I mean, I think you look at a guy like Rory, I think he watched Tiger's life disintegrate, and all the strife that Tiger's been through. And that helped Rory. Rory was kind of this swinging single guy, and he was chasing girls, and he was driving fast cars, and he was doing all that stuff. It was a little more low key and a little more controlled, but he was having his fun for sure. And I think he saw Tiger's life go up in flames. He's like, yeah, I better change my trajectory a little bit. I want to get married and have a kid and become extremely private and hide behind very tall hedges. And, I think Tiger and Phil have scared a lot of these guys straight. And
social media, by the way, like it's just a different time. It's just a different time. And there's not the veils that these guys mounted, from a business standpoint, from a personal standpoint, and all the stuff that they were involved in was just stuff that and Arnold benefited from that, and I'm sure many others of that era, not unlike in any sport or politics for that matter. And I just think it's such a different time. It's so hard to create those facades in what we're living in today.
I mean, it is wild. Tiger's, selling Buick family cars, and he's rendezvousing with porn stars, and Phil's the ultimate family man, skipping U.S. Opens for his kids' events, and he's got all this mob, all these shady dudes in his life, and all this other stuff. And I will say, Billy Walters in his book does write that I'm not going to get into Phil's private life. And that will be a monumental sigh of relief to Phil and the people around him, because they were very close. They moved in the same circles, whether it was the Madison Club in Palm Springs or wherever. And Billy knows a lot of stuff, and that he ultimately went, bro code and didn't put anything in print was a massive favor to Phil. And will again,
and quite frankly, separates Billy from Phil in a way. To your point about like Phil could have given a rope to his buddy, but chose not to.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, and also there is a little sliver of me, I just think Tiger and Phil were always fascinating. We were always drawn by their greatness on the course. They are just as fascinating off the course, and to your point again, will continue to be. It's amazing. It's amazing what we've been able to follow along and observe and witness. Sometimes it's been painful to watch. In many cases, it's been painful to watch. It's very much like going to a car race. I mean, they're going at very high speeds. It's high stakes. There's sharp turns. There's if you're not rubbing, you're not racing. These guys have been rubbing and racing for a long stretch of time and at very high speed. And to this point, they're still alive to tell about it and for us to watch, what's next. In a way, we thank you, Tiger and Phil.
Yeah. I got a little shudder when you said that, thinking about Tiger's car accident, and,
it's real.
It's real. And I've put this in print. I've talked about this before. I mean, it's dark when you start looking at the details of that accident. I mean, he's never talked about it. It's all in the police report, is how he bats it away. And in the police report, it says that pedal was depressed 99% force throughout the whole accident. Like, that doesn't happen if you fall asleep. That doesn't happen if you get distracted by your phone. Like, that's willful. And there's something dark there. And Junior Seau, if you remember, he had a one-car accident, and a lot of his friends were concerned about him because the story didn't check out. And then, of course, he wound up taking his own life. And I've always thought about the reporting around after Junior Seau was dead, when hearing about that accident and how concerned the people were in his world. And so, yeah, I mean, we've marveled at these guys as sportsmen, and they've enriched our lives in so many ways as golf fans. And the most transcendent moments of between the ropes of the last 3 decades have been from Tiger and Phil, and they've been these incredible characters. But there's also there's a dark side there, and there's a level of concern and the recklessness and the out of control aspects of their life. You're right; they're still here. It's somewhat incredible on some level, and Phil's still going strong. I mean, the guy almost won the freaking Masters a few months ago. So Tiger's paid a higher price, but it's real stuff. And I do have empathy for both of them because, and if you and I were given access to unlimited money and fame at a young age, like who knows what would have happened. They might be
Not
writing
good.
books about
Not
you
good.
and I. Like,
Not good.
so I'm not moralizing. I'm not condemning them. Like, we've all made
No.
our mistakes, but there's, as you said, it was at higher speeds and higher stakes. And when I going back to your question from a while ago, when I read this Billy's book, I felt some sadness for Phil. Because this was an important relationship in his life that's just been napalmed. And if you remember, what got Billy Walters' sentence commuted by President Trump was in part the support of the golf community. Butch Harmon, David Faraday, Peter Jacobson, they were among the guys who wrote letters in support of Billy Walters. Those are three of the most popular guys in golf, right? And from talking to people at the Madison Club and other places, you kind of had to pick sides. Were you with Phil or were you with Billy? And almost everyone took Billy's side. And, I've been told that Phil's not really welcome at the Madison Club anymore. And that was his home base in a lot of ways. But that was also Billy's spot. And so it's like the people close to them chose sides and they voted with their feet, and they all went with Billy. And, even writing this Live book, there's a theme with Greg Norman. It's like the emptiness in his life and the lack of friends has been this huge void, and he's destroyed a lot of friendships. And it kind of feels the same with Phil. Like the people that he was close to, the lot of them just been left behind. They don't have a new number. He's just become kind of this recluse, and so Billy Walters is part of that story, and he tells it pretty bluntly in this book. And so it's there's a heaviness to all of this. I mean, you have to shake your head in amazement and almost laugh about the numbers. They're so cartoonish of the betting. I mean, who bets $1 billion? It's like, it's hard you can't even process it, and you have to laugh, but there's a dark side to all of this. And so I think we're just going to see how it plays out, how Phil responds, and where we go from here.
The famous Andy Mill quote, former husband of Chris Everett, who palled around with Greg Norman and his wife, and then Chris Everett left Andy to be with Greg. They got married, divorced, and Andy Mill saying, "I would have taken a bullet for Greg. I just didn't know it was going to come from his gun."
Yeah, it is a classic. And
and that's essentially what Billy said at the end of the excerpt was, he was in the whitewater and needed a friend, and didn't happen. But wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, look at Nick Faldo. There's been a lot of messiness in his life. Lee Trevino, all the divorces and all the craziness. I mean, it really begs a question. Now you have your Jack Nicklaus's who are, been married to the same woman his whole life. And then there's exceptions to the rule, but a lot of these great champions, they're so single-minded. They just leave a lot of damage behind in their lives. And is it worth it? I mean, only they can answer that question. That's we've always had, this has come up in various times. Like, if you could give Tiger truth serum and ask him only one question, and people always have a different one. My answer is always the same. Was it worth it? I would curious what Tiger would say. I'm curious what Phil would say. Was it worth it? I mean, they've been to the mountaintop, and they've tasted some of the most glorious moments in sports history, and they've made fortunes, and they've lost fortunes, and they've lost marriages. They've like all of it. It's wild stuff.
And I think they only have an answer to that question right before the end. And so, and the story's still going. So I would imagine they probably need I would think they still need time. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think that's true. The story is still going. The book has been written. It is Billy Walters, a gambler. It's on sale everywhere next week. Of course, you can find it wherever you buy your books. It's an interesting read. And as I said, Phil's only 2 chapters in it. Billy's had a crazy life. I enjoyed learning more about him. I mean, he was born dirt poor in Kentucky, abandoned by his parents. Like, you talk about a hard knock life. It's really an American story, and with a lot of twists and turns. So anyone will enjoy this book, I believe. But the Mickelson stuff is the headlines. It's the raciest stuff, I think. So it's been interesting to pick it apart. Matt, thanks for doing this. Appreciate your insight.
Thank you, and thank you for continuing to be at the center of all of this in what I would say has been a rather impressive display of commitment, time, effort, energy, reporting, writing, podcasting, all the while doing any number of other things, including coaching your daughter's basketball team and being an incredible dad to the other 3 kids you have. So, I mean, it's amazing. It's always, it's great to work with you. It's also great to talk with you about what it is we do, and just incredible stuff yet again.
Yeah. Well, back at you. It's just funny because we're the same age as these guys. I mean, we came up, I mean, I turned pro the same year Tiger did. I left UCLA when Tiger left Stanford. When I was an intern at Sports Illustrated, that was Phil's second full season. You've been tracking them the whole way through as well. Like, it's just, my
life is complicated. Like, we both juggle a lot of things. When I read and hear about these guys' lives, I'm like, Jesus, like how many people in their inner circle are they keeping busy trying to keep up with these shenanigans?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've now spoken to 4 different lawyers for Phil Mickelson in the last couple of years. So that's, I mean, some
lawyer count is just so much lower than theirs. Like,
some people have a lawyer. If you're like really have a big life, you might have 2. I mean, he's got at least 4. It's wild.
Incredible. It's incredible.
Incredible. All right. Good stuff. Well, thanks for listening. This was another Fire Drill. We will be back at you with who knows what's coming next. There's always something here at the Firefly Collective, but we appreciate your fidelity. Thanks for listening. And this is the end. Goodbye.